Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Zoom presentation by Archie Rand of the evolution of the 613, his extraordinary, monumental work of art comprising 614 individual paintings measuring, I think, 20 by 16 inches, if I'm not mistaken. Archie will join us in just a moment. Before we begin, I just want to make sure that you feel warmly welcomed. There is closed captioning available for this presentation. You'll see other suggestions or indications of how to manage the Zoom program or application and how to engage with us and ask questions and so forth. You'll see those in the chat of the Zoom. I want to express my sincere gratitude to the Max and Marian Farish Charitable Foundation for making this exhibition possible, for bringing Archie Rand to Rochester. It's an extraordinary opportunity to enjoy, to learn, to feel challenged by a complicated and major work of art with far-reaching implications for how we understand history, how we understand tradition, and how we make meaning. So more on that in just a moment. I'd also like to thank Joan Brookbank Projects for partnering with the Memorial Art Gallery on realizing this exhibition in Rochester. I'd like you all to know that the Farish Foundation has sponsored 4 days of free admission during the run of the exhibition. May 16th, May 27th, June 27th, and July 8th. The Farish Foundation is dedicated to making the arts available to the broadest possible public, to every segment of our community. And so we thank them for the support of these free days. And I hope you will look forward to our Jewish Heritage Celebration Series event on June 13th, which is in partnership with the JCC, the Jewish Community Center. More details to come on that. If you do want to visit the exhibition, and I hope you do, please log on to mag.rochester.edu, reserve your timed entry tickets. You do need a timed entry ticket to visit the MAG these days. We are at 50% capacity on our galleries, which is great news, up from where we were. Members always get in free, so it's just a matter of reserving your tickets if you're a member. Now, about Archie Rand. For artists who deal with Jewish subject matter, Archie is considered a pioneer of Jewish iconography. And this makes him a maverick. This makes him an innovator. This makes him a pioneer because until the 613, we had pictures depicting Jewish life and Jewish tradition, but we didn't have an iconography of the religion, an iconography of Judaism. And Archie will tell you more about that, but he is a preeminent figure. He has conducted years and years of research and scholarship on religious iconography. He struggles with heady questions regarding the limits and allowances of the invention of iconography available in Hebrew culture and the notion and the fiction of symbols. It's not straightforward matter, but it is a lot of fun and the work is very engaging. And all you need to do is spend a little bit of time with it, and you're going to want to spend more time with it. Rand's work as a painter, a muralist, and a graphic artist is held in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Brooklyn Museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Smithsonian Institution, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale in France, the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, the Dallas Museum of Art. I could go on and on. His works are included in university and library collections, places like Harvard, Yale, Columbia, Brown, Johns Hopkins. He's been featured, his work has been featured in over 100 solo exhibitions. He is a regular collaborator with poets and has worked with Robert Creeley, John Ashbery, Kenneth Koch, Clark Coolidge, David Plant, John Yao, Bill Berkson, Marilyn Despiolis, David Lehman, Bob Holman, Ann Waldman, Louis Warsh, and David Shapiro. He has been awarded numerous honors, including the Achievement Medal for contributions to the visual arts by the National Foundation for Jewish Culture, and he is a recipient of a Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, a very impressive fellowship, very competitive, and a strong indication of the kind of intellect we are honored to host here in Rochester. He's formerly chair of the Department of Visual Arts at Columbia University. He is currently the presidential professor of art at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York. His home and his studio are located in Brooklyn, New York, but right now he is here in Rochester. So Archie, please, there you are. Welcome, Archie. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Jonathan.
And I'm going to pass the mic, pass the Zoom screen to you. I'm going to turn off my video, and I'll chime back in later on when we engage in a bit of a conversation.
Terrific. Thank you. It's, first of all, a great honor to have this work, the 613, installed at the Memorial Art Gallery. I must say that this is a unique installation. When I had originally envisioned this body of work, I had seen it as something that would be very tall and overpowering, and that the specifics of the individual panels wouldn't be as important as the effect of the total immersion in the unified gold panels that each of these pictures is framed with. However, what the Memorial Art Gallery has done is something I myself have never seen before, and I am happily shocked to see it, which is that these individual units of the 613 painting, which I see as one painting, have been installed only 4 units high. So all of them are at eye level, which means for the first time, actually, since I have done them, that is, I have learned something myself from this installation. From the first time since these pictures were created, I am able to, and I'm forced to, read them laterally and narratively. I have to look at each individual panel and read them across, very much the way they were philosophically envisioned by me to be something like an unraveling scroll, but never, not even in my own studio, were they installed that way. So this is a terrific installation, and one from which I've learned a lot about my own work, and I'm very happy to report that back to not only the Memorial Art Gallery, but to the city of Rochester. So thank you very much. I'm thrilled. What I'm going to talk about is how one ends up doing this kind of work, or more specifically, this particular body of work, which is immense. Obviously, when I created the work, I had no notion that any institution would ever show it, simply because of the arrogance of the enormity of it. It measures about 1,800 square feet. An intern of mine told me it was twice the size of James Rosenquist's F-111, which is a pretty large painting. So I thought that I would go back and use this opportunity to inform my viewers and listeners as to how this came about in my development as an artist. So can I have the first image, please? Okay. When I was a kid, I used to hang out with artists and poets. And by kid, I mean 15, 16 years old. And it was a very heady time in New York, where poetry, dance, music, art, theater, all of it was congealed into one sort of cultural coagulation. So everybody hung out with each other. You could be standing at the so-called artist bars, and you'd be standing next to a movie actor who'd be standing next to, you know, a premier modern dancer, who'd be standing next to a novelist, who'd be standing next to a painter, or next to a sculptor or musician. And I'm literally not kidding. I mean, bars like the Ninth Circle, or later Max's Kansas City, were gathering places for the arts where for the price of a beer, for 25 cents, you could sit next to Jasper Johns or Andy Warhol or any leftover Black Mountain painter or second or third generation abstract expressionist or minimalist, and basically get an education. That kind of education has been in recent times relegated to graduate programs. But there was a time when you could learn simply by listening to artists talk, and they would coagulate like flies to honey, the booze being the honey. Gilbert Sorrentino was a New York School poet who befriended me at a very young age. He was a very opinionated man. He was great fun to listen to because he was extremely critical and very sarcastic and very funny. And that's very attractive to a young person. And Gil would structure his poems and his novels by using almost irrelevant imported numeric systems. Like he would do a series with a certain selected, pre-selected number, or filling out the letters of the alphabet, A equals one chapter, B equals another chapter, until he gets to XYZ. And I found that a wonderful way to allow the expansion of what visual art was becoming at the time, or painting more specifically, under the godhead of Jackson Pollock making very large paintings. It was a way to structure what was loosely called the field. And the question was, how does one escape from the field? And I found that this kind of externally imposed armature had its founding in mostly in France with a literary group called the Oulipo movement. It's Oulipo. And they, in fact, would irrationally, under the influence of people like probably Marcel Duchamp, take irrelevant structures and impose their work into those structures. We see in this country people like John Cage taking advantage of that. The only American writer, I think, that openly admitted to being an adherent to that movement was the poet and novelist Harry Matthews, who in fact, I believe, was either the husband or partner of Nicky de Saint-Phalle. So he had that connection to France and therefore access to that kind of thinking. But that deeply influenced me. So that, along with seeing Orozco's murals in the Museum of Modern Art, where he did them in sections and then combined them, showed me a way to have what I called to myself something called consecutive or simultaneous sequence, where the sequence would be presented linearly, but it would be absorbed simultaneously. So if we can go to the next picture, please. Yeah. So I'm looking at what I thought Pollock was looking at, which was Mexican murals. And as you can see from the lighting fixtures, this painting is about 40 feet long. And it was done in 1967. And there's an Olmec head on one side, and then there's some more recent people in female garb. And it was just my way of emulating the Mexican muralist movement that I knew had influenced Jackson Pollock. All of which is to say, I did not start out thinking of myself in any way as a painter with religious interests, or at least not interests that were germane to my particular heritage, which was Judaism, but I was perfectly willing to invade Aztec culture, as did the legitimate inheritance of that, the great Mexican muralists. So I tried that out. And then when I realized that that wasn't native to my particular visual tongue, next slide, please. I started to take irrelevant images and combine them into single paintings. This particular painting is about 9 feet high. This is about 1968 or so. And you can see already the segmentation of varied elements that are sort of forced together into a uniform surface, making them have conversation with each other. The areas that are black in this picture were things that I thought were not having conversation. So they were completed pictures that I simply painted out. And the residue or the evidence of that can be seen in the reflection of the light. On the lower left-hand corner is the name of the rhythm and blues or vocal quartet, the Cadillacs, which were very formative on me as a young person, because I did a lot of listening to basically African-American music from, about bebop to about the late 1960s when this was painted. And that included both jazz, or what is called jazz, and the vocal quartets, which came out of gospel and became secular, of which I was very fond. And the Cadillacs was one of those groups. The Cadillacs had been derived from a series of figure paintings that I had done, where the figures became eventually, through evolution, letters. Next slide, please. So looking at Jackson Pollock, you can see this is an unrolled bolt of canvas. So if the bolt is 6 feet high, let me see, you figure this is about 30 feet long. I would unroll a bolt of canvas and I would do these abstracted figures done from sketches that were done from life. That is, I would have a model pose and I would do these quick gesture drawings and then translate those gesture drawings onto a larger surface in a sort of field composition. And eventually, those letters started to suggest to me, next slide, please, letters. And those letters, I knew I needed a narrative for. I just couldn't put letters up, although I did. The initial paintings would have sort of irrelevant letters, like I did some paintings that said EDVXK, or I formally reorganized the alphabet depending on what would happen if the letters morphed, like A would become B if you close the bottom of the letter A. So I rearranged the alphabet that way. And eventually I just started to write these names in homage to these people. Now the picture in the foreground, this is a show at Exit Art of some of those paintings. You see the marvelettes where each of those letters is given enough space to breathe. And in the upper left-hand corner in the back is the original Cadillacs painting from 1967. I just continued to work on those, but you can see that they start to become segmented, as you can see in the right-hand side. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is more of that same exhibition. There are the Chantels on the yellow painting. Anita O'Day has her own segment. Cecil Taylor has his own segment. And the painting on the bottom right, Fats Navarro is behind that person's head. Bud Powell is mentioned 3 or 4 times in 3 different sections in the painting on the upper left-hand corner. So at this point, I start to get the notion that you can present a number of different subjects and give them all equal presence. At the time, I thought to myself, and this is where Judaic thought first came in, that I was writing what's called a Torah scroll, or that scroll where the Bible is written out and read back in sections every week in the Sabbath services. Although myself, I did not have any particular observance, I was certainly well aware of it. I had gone to religious instruction or Hebrew school as a young person. And the idea of making a scroll to these African-American musicians was in fact something that I considered to be a tombstone. It is an homage. I would simply put their names up so that as paintings, they would remain as physical manifest objects that would announce or transmit their name to the viewers that saw these paintings. Again, these paintings were rather large. They were not the kinds of things I expected to be commercially viable, but there was an emotional attachment to them, which kept my narrative going on these for a number of years. Next, please. So here are some more of them. As I said, this series went on from about 1967 to about 1971 or so. And again, there's many names that were done with a pastry gun. I was investigating different acrylic chemistry. Acrylic painting was rather new at the time, so almost every artist was inventing their own paint. We were working with many, many companies, mostly Rome and Haas, but because the acrylic technology was so new, we could add acids and things to balance the pH and get all kinds of effects out of it, making our own pigments that painters today seem less interested in. But you could do all kinds of stuff with acrylic paint, and that was part of the excitement, was giving individual character to each of these boxes of named information. Next, please. And here's an example. These are 4 titles of compositions written by the composer Tad Dameron. And on the left, it says Hot House, and then Fountain Blue, and Good Bait, and Our Delight. Many of these tunes were made popular by the trumpeter Fats Navarro. All of this was a kind of secret religion of mine. I would basically play these records continually and collect these records. You can see that the acrylic paint was squeezed out of pastry tubes, thickened up, gone over with gold flecks. There was all kinds of stuff you could do with this basically liquid plastic. Next slide, please. So here are some small versions. There's about 100 of these, and these range about 18 inches high by 6 feet long. And you get a further example of the notion of segmentation compressed into a unity. Now, again, this is all using secular information. Basically, my homage to African-American music. I read an article a couple of years ago by the writer A.J. Hoberman, who said that when he went to Washington Square Park in New York in the 60s, and they were all playing folk music, they encountered a mountain musician, somebody from the Appalachians, who was playing, bluegrass or country music. And there was a bunch of New York musicians who were very adept at that. And they played along with this musician very well. And the musician said to Hoberman in particular, ain't you guys got any of your own music? And as a Jewish New Yorker, Hoberman found that to be a very salient question. And the answer was no. We're playing either blues, African-American blues, or country music and bluegrass. The notion that there was a Jewish music, of course, was furthered by people like Andy Statman, who became one of the first klezmer musicians. I went to college with Andy, and Andy was a remarkable bluegrass mandolinist. And Andy was one of those people who, although probably not asked that question directly, realized that he did have some place to go. It was simply not a popular place to go. And he went into Jewish music. I was fully aware of that at the time, although at the time I did not think that it affected me. Next slide, please. Then in 1974, I received a commission to paint the entire interior of an Orthodox synagogue in Brooklyn. And I had no idea that there was no such thing as a narratively painted synagogue. The last one apparently that was uncovered was in 2nd century Syria at Dura Europos. And since then, whatever evidence we have of painted synagogues, like the painted synagogues in Poland, were not narrative, but texturally based with some symbolic decorative objects, like Eliezer Sussman, who's probably the most famous of the wooden synagogue painters in the 1700s, about contemporary with Mozart. So I received this commission, and I put up the obligatory menorah, which you see on that wall. The congregation was a Middle Eastern congregation. So in deference to their cultural background, I gave it a sort of carpet page illustration. And then I put up the requisite 6-pointed star. And I realized that I had an enormous amount of square footage to cover and no Jewish iconography that would fit. Again, this is being done for an Orthodox synagogue. The rabbinate had to check everything to make sure that I wasn't doing anything sacrilegious. They were, in fact, from the outset, very upset that I was doing this because there was no visual precedent for what I was doing, especially within a synagogue, where legitimately it could be claimed, as do the Shakers, that having decoration on the wall in an iconoclastic culture distracts from the severity and the sincerity of one's prayer. So there was some discussion bordering on the quasi-violent as to whether or not my work should continue. Next slide, please. When I got to one of the panels, which I may or may not have a picture for, the leaders of the congregation became very upset. Ah, that's better. The leaders of the congregation became very upset. Not unrightfully. This was a precedent-setting activity, and there was a lot of pressure on me to stop work, and the work was taken to a rabbinical trial. And at the trial, the world's leading Talmudic scholar, a man named Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who at that time was very on in years, declared the works to be kosher. He said there are two conflicting sets of laws. The one that he selected took precedence. Nobody would argue with the verdict of Rabbi Feinstein. So he said they were kosher. And this work was not only allowed to continue, but in fact, what he had said was a de facto permission for anyone to make Jewish art or Jewishly inflected art, even in the most sacred of places, that it was legally permitted. I was very happy about that. Understand, I was very intimidated by the obligation that I had to make sure that everything I was doing was not necessarily informed by a history of non-Jewish visual information, but I had to do things that would be informed, that could be backed up textually. That is, if a rabbi came over and said, "What's that?" I had to have chapter and verse down in my head as to what it was I was illustrating. Basically, I was making visual images to any noun I could find. That is, if I was trying to study what kind of image to make, and some scholar said to me, "Oh, well, God is great and wonderful and is surrounded by glory," and I'd go, "Okay." And he sits in a throne. I said, "Wait a second, God sits in a throne? I got a noun. I can paint a throne. I can't paint glory." So I went through the entire liturgy and scripture and commentary looking for nouns that would be acceptable into individual panels. That is, the ones that we're looking at now are two irrelevant subjects that are butted together. On the far left, you have the tree of life. In the center, you have the four animals mentioned in the Ethics of the Fathers by Rabbi Judah ben Tema. And on the far right, in this particular wall, you have the 7 species of fruits of the land of Israel, surrounded by the rivers coming from the Garden of Eden and milk and honey, and that mandala on the wall. Next to it, that circle is beseeching God before prayer to have your prayers be done with sincerity. One of the things I realized that was consonant not only with Judaic legal history, but with my concept about how art should be made, was I wanted to make something that would parallel the religious wall work of other religions, of the great Buddhist temples or the Ajanta caves or the Aztec murals or all of the wonderful, Italian murals. But the difference is that to a greater degree, the artwork made by those religions subscribed to a much more inflexible notion of what the religion represented. And I know I can get argument about this, but generally, Judaism is fairly loose. Unless you're an Orthodox person, which many people are not. Judaism incorporates everything from from Greenpeace to Larry David, the way it's actually practiced. And because of that inconsistency, that Talmudic notion that you can have, a dozen different answers to one question from different rabbis and none of them take precedent, that the notion of making a unified style or a unified narrative development was actually contrary to the chaos that is Judaism. And it's a chaos that I was brought up acknowledging as being comfortable. One was constantly juggling something in the air. One was never settled or satisfied with the right way to do something. There was no right way. It was really dependent on one's aesthetic and moral judgment. So this continued to foster the idea that I could have segmented narrative elements that were basically irrelevant to each other, but were still under the larger umbrella of a certain kind of overall thematic reverence. Next picture, please. When I got to this wall over here, which is creation, because creation pre-exists, let there be light, the initial wall was painted black. Well, once you paint a wall black, the congregation gets very, very, very upset, especially since it's on the same wall where the Torah scroll is housed. Black has a traditional reference to, God forbid, death. And it was not a good thing to do. And my argument was that this is a visual illustration of a narrative that's very consistent with the Bible. It finally won out. You can see a little bit on the right-hand side of a running 80-foot wall I did that's about 20 feet high, which is an imitation of the Western Wall in Jerusalem of the temple, which was the first part of the commission. There's a lot of Kabbalistic stuff in that star on the left. I'm not going to get into that. Could we have the next picture, please? Okay. After the synagogue was completed, it got notice in art magazines, which to my recall was a fairly novel occurrence. There was a very large article in Arts Magazine by, in fact, my dear friend Ross Feld. And then there was another one-page article in Arts Magazine, that is, they covered it twice, by Pamela Jablons, which talked about B'nai Yosef in purely, B'nai Yosef was the name of the synagogue, that talked about the murals at B'nai Yosef in purely secular terms, that is, they were being evaluated aesthetically. So in that case, the religious art that I had done was now being spoken about as if it were a purely secular object that had the same kind of velocity behind it that Andy Warhol's Love of Stars or that action painting had, that there was a pre-existent narrative, this one being a religious one, that supported the visual product. And that, to my experience, was fairly unique. But because of that, the Jewish art collectors throughout the country who read the magazine figured I was the guy that they could come to, because I was an artist and not just a Jewish guy making art who dealt with Jewish stuff. So I got a lot of commissions. This is one of the shots of the 12 tribes of Israel that I was commissioned to do almost immediately after, and B'nai Yosef was finished maybe 2 years later. This is in Anshe Emet in Chicago. Next slide, please. And this is one of 3 stained glass windows that I did for Temple Shalom in Chicago. The first Anshe Emet was a conservative. Temple Shalom is a Reform synagogue. And I was able to, again, merge together all of this iconographic distillate that I had come across through the years of studying for the synagogue murals. And as you can see, there's just a lot of stuff thrown in there. But all of that stuff is relevant to a kind of Talmudic way of thinking. That is, there are connections being made if you can link together the stories. This particular one is just Abraham. And all hell's breaking loose in this picture. But if you are familiar with the narrative of Abraham, you can see how one thing relates to the other. Why, for instance, he's looking up at the knife and why the ram is below, and all that stuff is there. And between that, he's got to cross the fire and okay, whatever. Next slide, please. Then in 1984, a dear patron of mine, Carl and Sylvia Fryer, had a daughter who was going to the Jerusalem Teachers College, and they asked if I would do exterior murals in the courtyard of the college. So I realized I was doing external murals in a place where the heat goes to 110 degrees and you have sandstorms. This was at that time on the outskirts of Jerusalem in a place called Bayit Vegan, it's a suburb. But before I did it, I had to work with Roman Haas, Ciba-Geigy, Union Carbide, and one other. Union Carbide, Roman Haas, Ciba-Geigy, somebody else. In coming up with an external paint that would withstand all of those elements. So I worked with Mark Golden of Golden Paints. Those of you who paint know Mark, know the Golden Company. And it took about a year to develop this system. And these are the 7 days of creation that are in the courtyard, and they go from right to left. So day 1 is that hemispheric thing. Day 2 are those albrecht-dürer wings. But I wanted to show that to you because I want you to focus on those wings on day 2. Next slide, please. Okay, that is a close-up of that particular mural. It's basically acrylic on stone. I had to put sulfuric acid on the wall. That's a whole other lecture. When I came back from Jerusalem, I had had a tremendous fight with the rabbis at the college who were dead set against any kind of visual information, painting. So I had to illustrate every rabbinical commentary I could get my hands on, which gave me literally hundreds of pieces of iconographic information. And the iconographic information were simply illustrations of biblical commentary or text. Next slide, please. When I came back to New York, I was showing with the Phyllis Kine Gallery, and I couldn't resist it. This painting's about 35 feet long and maybe 14 feet high or something. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner, I couldn't resist putting that imagery, and I just thought it was so cool. And a critic for Art Forum said, there's obviously, Hebraic or Judaic references in this picture. And I thought, well, the cat's out of the bag. I might as well stop keeping these things apart and meld it all into one conversation. Again, you can see how disparate these elements are. The whole idea of this conversation is something that interested me. Next slide, please. Okay, and there it is in the painting. Next slide, please. Got another commission to do a Hashkivenu prayer, which is a prayer that basically says, God, when I go to sleep, I hope I wake up in the morning. And that was commissioned oddly and macabrely enough for an old age home. That's acrylic on plaster. It's actually a pure fresco. The plaster was wet, and I really enjoyed doing that. And I just wanted to show it as another example of putting all kinds of information together, assuming that the rubric of the actual prayer would house the entire collection of imagery. Again, I'm trying to give you a background as to why the 613 is a logical projection for me. This is sometime in the mid-80s or so. Go ahead, next. About 1985, I did a series called The Rabbis, and it was the most reproduced picture I've ever had. It was in the Times, it was in Vogue, it was in like maybe 10 magazines. And I realized that the reason it was being reproduced was because the editors thought I was being sarcastic. And I wasn't being sarcastic. I was just saying, after all the fights I'd had with all the rabbis, that these are just normal people. Some of them are very nice, and some of them are weird, and some of them are very authoritarian, and some of them are rather liberal and flexible like everybody else. So I started to do these cartoony things. So next slide, please. Sometime in the late 80s, 1989, I figured, well, let me see if I can delve right into Jewishness and see if I can do it as if there's no stigma about being Jewish. That is, if there's no anti-Semitism and if there's no shame from the internal Jewish community. In the introduction to the book, The 613, I have this Lenny Bruce quote where somebody says to him, what's your name? He says, Lenny Bruce. And he said, no, what's your real name? He says, Schneider, Louis Schneider. And the interrogator says, well, why isn't Louis Schneider up on the marquee? He said, well, it's not show business. And the interrogator says, are you Jewish? And Lenny Bruce says, yeah, I'm Jewish. He says, you ashamed you're Jewish? And Bruce says, yeah. And the interrogator says, why are you ashamed you're Jewish? And that's the end of the bit. And I thought, that's a good line, you know, like, let's just bring this stuff out. So I did the 54 chapters of the way the 5 books of Moses, the Jewish Bible, is presented every week in synagogue. And when I presented it to the Jewish Museum said, we can't show these, they're too Jewish. And I said, well, if they're too Jewish for the Jewish Museum, who's going to show them? So to his great credit, the curator, Norman Kleeblatt, decided to show the paintings, but contextualize them with other artists who were doing Judaically inspired work, among which was my dear friend, the late Helene Alon, who was doing some phenomenal stuff as well. It was an interesting show called Too Jewish. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. So there's a couple of those. There's Moses in the desert with all the iconography, with all of the stuff comes from what Jews call midrash, which is rabbinical commentary, or the oral Torah, which is where you get most of your fascinating narrative from. Next. 1992, again, I'm doing a lot of stuff in the meantime. I'm just showing you things that relate to the 613. I did a series called 60 Paintings from the Bible, where I took traditional biblical illustration and I put word bubbles in the mouths of these people, these characters in the scripture, which were roughly English translations of what's actually being said in the original Hebrew, and they're said in the vernacular. And this was presented at the Arthur Roger Gallery by the critic and curator Dan Cameron. So it was presented as a totally secular work, using almost the conceptual backdrop of its having a Jewish narrative, which was actually seen as a kind of funny thing to do at the time. Next. So there are things like that. Adam and Eve saying we're naked. Next. Another series based on a letter that was written from Israel while the Ramban rabbi was exiled from Spain in Girona. These are things that there was absolutely no market for. I just wanted to engage the most obscure Jewish works, literary works, in visual terms, just because I hadn't seen them. I mean, Barnett Newman had said that artists paint things because they want things to look at. I just wanted to see what it looked like. Next. So that's sort of what they looked like. That's part of a letter that the Ramban had written. The English is on one side, the Hebrew is on the bottom. Next. There's a series of 40 Sicilian playing cards where the number 40 pops up a lot. It's odd that there's only 40 cards in the deck instead of 52. And the inscription on the bottom, next slide, please. Says the rain, it says in Hebrew, and the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, referring to the flood of Noah. The 40 cards are divided up into 4 sections of 10 cards each, representing the 10 plagues that get brought down in 4 different ways, one of which is in evil messengers. This is all rabbinic commentary, and it's a very rich source material for an artist. Next, please. This is Psalm 68. Next, please. Again, there's no clientele for these. As smoke disperses, let the wicked perish in the face of God. I mean, who's going to hang that in the living room? Next. This is Kabala Tarou. Again, taking the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and putting them against the 22 major arcana of the Tarot. Next. And you can see the humor come in here as well. Next. It's a series of paintings based on 2 songs from Passover. Next. It's one of those. There's a Hebrew letter in the middle. Next. Another one. Next. It's a show from 1990, which is very, very relevant to the 613. This is a totally secular show at the Paolo Baldacci Gallery, and that was one of the paintings that was in the show. And you can see this is a format that I work in that has a history as long as I've been painting, which is the point I was trying to make. Next. It's the 18 Benediction Prayers. Next.
Archie?
Yes.
We have a collection of questions from the audience.
Okay,
Uh,
I got about 3 more to go. Let me run
Go
through it,
right.
all right? Okay,
Terrific.
next. There's 39 forbidden labors of the Sabbath. Next. Next. Next.
Zach,
Whoop.
listen.
Yes.
Well, I was just wondering about 49 forbidden labors of the Sabbath picture like this. How is that different or similar to the mechanics of the 613? In other words, last night you talked a lot about, very interestingly, about the 613 as an iconography,
Yeah.
which is symbols and signs. And there was a question about Marc Chagall, and you talked about the difference. You contrasted Chagall with your work, narrative, depictions, and subject matter. So if you go forward one slide, I'm just wondering, an image like this, is it functioning more like Chagall, or is it, and as content and representation, or is it functioning more like an iconography? And tell us a little bit about how the 613, how it's, if it is different from the work. I mean, is it to be distinguished in some manner of matter of logic from your prior work?
Yes, that's a great question. Thank you. This picture is halfway between Chagall and the 613. That is, in the 39 forbidden labors of the Sabbath, there are actually individual pictures about 39 things you can't do. This is like, you can't dig the foundation of a house. So there's this Wonder Woman type person throwing rocks around and stuff. So it's half illustration and half, the insertion of the unconscious, the imagination. So these paintings can be broken up. That is, if someone were to say to me, I want to buy that painting, we can break up the 39 forbidden labors of the Sabbath, although I wanted them shown as a group. The 613 is one painting. You can't break it up because some of these things are not only not illustrational, but they're so obscure that even subconsciously, they can't be separated from the totality of that thing I was talking about with the jazz paintings, where each segment sort of psychically connects rather than literally connects. In the 39 forbidden labors of the Sabbath, they almost literally connect. That is, these are 39 things you can't do. Now, one would think that 613 commandments are 613 things you either can or can't do. There's negative and positive commandments. But in fact, the way the entire 613 is constructed is to have the larger interaction at play of the totality of it. That's not functioning here. This is more like Chagall. That is, this is illustration, but it's more imaginative illustration. So it's a great question. Let me just run through the rest of them real quickly. I won't even say anything, just go through them. That's, again, Esther. Okay, this is important. This was a series I did in the Chad Gadya. You see, I'm almost through. Next slide. And there in the background, you see the 613 starting to be constructed. So I was going from this type of Jewish imagery to the insanity of like, what can I do after I'm through illustrating everything? So if you see those on the wall in the studio starting to be constructed, you can go to the next slide, and that's it. And that's what we ended up with. Okay, floor is all yours. Yes.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating because there really is an evolution. There's so much to discuss here. Back up with the slide, please. Yeah, just give us that. Because is there an evolution in your painting style as well, do you think? Or were you not as focused on that part as you were focused on the evolution of a conceptual framework for engaging with Jewish tradition and liturgy through visual images?
Yeah, in the other paintings, as you can see, they're done in a kind of cartoon style, but that was sort of by conscious choice in a sense. That is, I figured, oh, this is a good way to get some laughs and have a good time with myself. When I did this, I realized that there is a distinction. It's a good question. I realized that it was now my obligation, because I was doing something of such scale that I couldn't treat this flippantly, that I had to actually think what I said yesterday about where Jewish or how Jewish imagery or somebody dealing with Jewish imagery should present it in terms of the intelligence of the visual style. One of the things I was getting to before with B'nai Yosef was, unlike, let's say, Piero della Francesca or Giotto, where you have a very consistent style, because you have basically a hierarchical religion. Since Judaism is not hierarchical, I was obligated, at least I thought I was obligated, to mix up styles in a crazy way, just anything I could throw into it. And that was sort of Jewish, but the actual imagery was derived significantly from the Jewish comic book artists of the 30s, 40s, and 50s that I thought had basically invented a style that I would simply demand to call a Jewish style of work, which is the comic book style. So this was done knowing I was paying homage to, late Pulp Fiction covers and mostly EC and DC cartoon style. Yeah.
Do you, I think you mentioned that you're not a practicing Jew, that you don't observe it as a matter of some kind of expression of religiosity, I suppose. Do you think it? I mean, do you think it helps to be Jewish or to be a Judeophile to see this work? I mean,
no. I mean, no more than it helps to be a 15th century Catholic to appreciate Piero della Francesca. That is, one can, or for that matter, the Aztec murals. I mean, we don't have to, take our best friend and cut his heart out on top of the stairs and throw it down into a fire to, appreciate, the incredible Aztec visual imagery. The visual imagery, in a sense, has to support itself on its own terms. And, one of the things I think about when I look at this is, I'm looking at this picture in particular that was taken by my friend Richard McBee, is, does it work as a totality, as a visual experience, rather than the art historical interest of the specificity of the particular images, which of course is on its own merits interesting, but it somehow narrows in so far to the particulars of the picture that it misses the egotistic word for it would be grandeur of the picture. I remember that when I was hanging out with the Clement Greenberg guys, that one of the quotes I remembered from Morris Lewis was, "There is no such thing as the good part of a bad painting or the bad part of a good painting. That is, it either works as a totality or it doesn't work." And that's one of the things that stayed with me ever since I was a kid, that particular notion of how a work of art is constructed and made. But I don't think that it helps, particularly whether or not one is observant. In fact, I think if one is observant and is knowledgeable in Jewish literature, it would actually confound them, because the stretches that are made in this picture of what the actual commandment is and the visual representation I give to it is so large that the synapse might snap on somebody who is sticking strictly to the commentary. I may have mentioned that yesterday when I talked about the egg, and the rabbi I'll very briefly I have an egg talking to a woman, and it refers, in the 613, it refers to the laws of menstrual purity. And a rabbi came to me very indignant and said, "How dare you take one of the commandments and relegate it to this cartoon of Humpty Dumpty?" And I said, "Well, that's an egg." And he said, "Well, what does an egg have to do with menstruation?" And I figured, I'm dealing with somebody who's a literalist. And if you're a literalist, then the visual isn't particularly your cup of tea. Yeah.
do you? It's probably not a fair question, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you have any hope for the impact this work of art will have on viewers? Does that get inflected by who's visiting? A lay person, or I'm just wondering about the wonderful Rabbi Hein down the street here in Pittsford at the Chabad House. Do you have a different hope for his experience of the work of art?
Well, no, I find that Chabad, and for those of you that aren't familiar, that's a rather liberal sect of the Orthodox wing, has been, fairly comically amused by this work. Other other factors have not. So my best regards to Rabbi Hain, of course. I'm happy that it's being shown in MAG, because what you're exhibiting this painting does is it validates it primarily as a visual and not necessarily as a religious element. And as such, it was meant to be open to all viewers. And as I said, more observant Jewish viewers will probably be put off more than less observant or non-Jews. When I first showed this painting in the neighborhood that I was in, where I put it up, I mean, that's the wall I put it up on in what was my factory warehouse. We opened the doors, and I would venture to say that 7/8 of all the people who came to see it, and the Times reported that 1,000 people came to see it, were not Jewish. And the kids loved it. I'm hoping, my hope is that kids dig the picture, that adults enjoy the fact that it's not frivolous, because it was based on a sincere desire to make a visual artifact for something that had no visual artifact previously. And someone, regardless of their religious or philosophical persuasion, if this painting has an effect on them, it will allow them to, pursue some kind of visual manifestation for that. And that would just be great. I don't think it's fair for an artist to suggest what type of effect it would have, especially since I didn't think this painting would ever be seen by human eyes after I did it. So, I'm grateful that it's up. Whatever effect it has, I'm sure will be for the best. So I'm grateful for that.
A question about the use, is it the synagogue in Brooklyn, B'nai Yosef?
Yes.
Were the sexes seated separately, women upstairs, men downstairs, something like that? Did this influence your decisions about the subjects you painted?
Absolutely. Yes. I was commanded not to put anything on the wall that I couldn't verify scripturally to any questioner. So everything on all multi-thousand square feet of wall, every smudge, every brushstroke, if some rabbi says to me, "What's that?" I had to know what it was to their satisfaction, which means I had to do all of the studying. So downstairs, everything is scriptural and literal and commentary based. Upstairs, and this is where the sexism comes in, but it's part of a culture, the women weren't supposed to learn or study. The Orthodox call it learning. The women had their own job within the Orthodox Jewish structure, which one has to respect in a certain sense. That's what they do. And the women sat upstairs. So everything there I had to be able to explain to the rabbi the same way downstairs, but none of it could be visually decipherable. So upstairs are abstractions of literary documents. Downstairs are representations of literary documents, of scriptural documents. So if the rabbi says, "What's that?" I say, "Well, that's the crossing of the Red Sea." And the rabbi would say, "Oh, I see." But it would basically be like a long white line against a blue field, or "What's that multifaceted painting in the women's section with 400 different squares?" And I'll say, "That's the abundance of miracles on the expulsion from Egypt." And say, "Oh, I see." So the upstairs is abstract, with the exception of the Tomb of Rachel and a Kabbalistically oriented six-pointed star, a painting of a Torah case. But the 10 plagues are up there, but they're all symbolic and abstracted. I have a shofar, a ram's horn. I have a boat for Jonah, because everyone knows Jonah. But that's really about it in terms of what I could put up in the women's section.
So thank you. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. One final question.
Sure.
Our viewer today asks about Hieronymus Bosch, and if there's a relationship between the iconography of 613 and maybe the work or the mechanics of a Bosch painting.
Absolutely. It's a great question. It's one I hadn't thought about, but I love Bosch. I mean, who doesn't? And You know, whenever you look at Bosch, you think, oh, what a great imagination. But you realize that what Bosch is doing is he's literally representing whatever the priesthood tells him is going on if you go to heaven or hell or purgatory. And, you know, people look at that as if it's wonderful and imaginative and childish and, you know, been beautifully painted. And, you know, I'm thinking of that quote from Delacroix, which actually is a great link between Bosch and, I humbly say, the 613. Delacroix says that the public would like to think that artists are children who never grew up, but in fact, artists are adults who never had a childhood. And Bosch's skill shows that he's certainly an adult, and his imagery shows his yearning for the retention of youthful imagination, which he does probably better than anybody in the history of Western art. So it's a great question, and that's my answer.
And I got to ask one more question. What's your plan for your residency here in Rochester? What are you going to be up to? What's next?
I'm going to bring a bunch of stuff with me, and I'm going to let the environment marinate my brain. And because of the isolation and the distance from the usual workstation, I will try to do something that it's always bad to talk about what you're going to do because you never know. But I will try to use this residency for the best possible advancement of whatever series I come up with. I mean, I have some ideas of what I want to do, but anybody out there who's a painter knows that the worst thing you can have is an idea because it changes on you very quickly as you work. So we'll see. I will guarantee my diligence, that I can guarantee, but that's about it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Archie. We're delighted to have you in Rochester. We're so thrilled about this exhibition. I'm loving it because I can really sink my teeth into this and know that I'm not going to ever take a bite out of whatever it is that I sink my teeth into. So that inspires me. I want to thank again the Maximilian Farish Charitable Foundation for their support of this project. I'd love to thank Joan Brookbank Projects for their collaboration, Joan Brookbank's collaboration and support of this project in Rochester. Thank you all for joining us today. Visit the MAG soon, get your time tickets online. If you're a member, of course, it's just a matter of making a reservation because you get in free. And we look forward to seeing you at our Jewish Heritage Celebration Day, free days sponsored by the Farish Foundation, any and all of the above. Thanks for joining us on this Sunday.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.